Hey, eighth grade. Miss Boyd here. And I know this week is chapter 21 through 24. But I realized that I forgot to put 20. I talked about 20 on the last one, so I'm going to add 20 on here, okay? So, chapter 20. I totally messed that up and didn't realize after I posted the video. So, I'm just going to add it to this week's. So, 20 picks up with Dolphus Raymond out there talking to the kids. And if you remember, Dill was talking about how he doesn't like how Mr. Gilmer is treating and addressing Tom. Like he's not important, that he's less than a human being, all of those things. And so Dolphus Raymond says, I've got something that'll settle your stomach. And of course, the rumor is that he drinks whiskey out of that bag, and it's really just Coca-Cola. And as they're talking, the kids are like, well, why do you pretend to be a drunk? It doesn't make any sense to them. And he says the reason he does it is because it gives people a reason to basically blame how he lives on that reason. Okay, so they blame the fact that he's married to a black woman and has mixed children and lives by the African American community on the fact that he's a drunk and he's not right in his head. So for him, he's like, it makes it easier on them. And I don't come to town that often. I'm going to live the way I want to, anyways, but it gives them something to blame it on. So, as they're talking, he says the reason that he's telling them this is that they're kids, and just the fact that Dill cried in there, they can understand what's happening more so. And he says, but as you get older, he says things haven't caught up with you yet, or the views of Macomb County, or just the stereotypical views of the South haven't caught up with them yet. And he says it seems like the only time anybody cares when people are rude to others is children. They're the only ones that pick up on it and that cry. And he says that people that cry about being rude to others just because, or being mean to others just because they have a different skin color. And Scout says that Atticus talks to her and says that cheating, he says, Atticus says cheating a colored man is 10 times worse than cheating a white man. Says it's the worst thing you can do. And then Mr. Raymond says something, and he says, Miss Jean Louise, you don't know something, but your pa's not a run of the mill man. He's not a normal man. He's an extraordinary man. And it says it'll take you a few years for that to sink in, because he says you haven't seen enough of the world yet. You don't understand everything just yet. But eventually you will, and you'll see that your father is not like everyone else. He's above everyone else in his views, if that makes sense. Because it kind of addresses that in the next 4 chapters, is that he's not like everyone else. And so the people of Macomb County call on him when they need someone to stand up. So at this point, they go back into the courtroom, and then you have Atticus's closing arguments, which are huge to this book. I have a friend that I graduated high school with, and he said this chapter is the whole reason he became a lawyer. His closing arguments, this was it. And it says he starts off by loosening his tie and his collar and taking off his jacket. And it says Scout and Jim are just staring like, oh my goodness. They said this is the equivalent of him standing stark naked in front of everyone. And it's like he's bearing everything he has in this moment. Okay. And he talks about the fact that they have absolutely no evidence, and that the testimonies themselves have serious holes in them, and that most of the evidence that's been presented contradicts what the Ewells are saying. And he says the only person who's guilty here is of basically Mayella breaking a code that Southern Alabama has, okay? And that is she kissed an African American. That doesn't happen, okay? And when Bobby Ewell sees it, the quickest thing he can do to fix it is say, well, Tom Robinson raped my daughter. because there's no way Bobby Ewell is going to let anybody know that Mayella is attracted to Tom Robinson. It's not going to happen. And um, he goes through there and he talks about the stereotypes that are presented. And he said the evil assumption that all Negroes lie, that all Negroes are basically immoral beings, that all Negro men are not to be trusted around women. And he said that right there is a lie. And he says, as black as Tom Robinson's skin. That can be applied to every man. He says some men lie. It doesn't matter what color you are. Some men can't be trusted. Some men are immoral. And he said, at this point where they are, he talks about Thomas Jefferson saying that all men are created equal. And he said that idea, that premise is good, but it's not true. He's like, none of us are created equal. I love certain things like, I don't know, I like to read. I don't know. I'm decent at organizing. That's, one of my gifts. And then I think about some of you, and some of your gifts might be art. It might be basketball. It might be acting. And that's what he means. He's like, we're not all equal in that sense. We all have different gifts that make us different from one another. But he says when you get in the courtroom, that idea, all men are created equal, should be there, and that when you walk into a courtroom as a jury, your job is to convict without bias, without prejudice. And that's why he says, in the name of God, do your duty to the jury. Because when you walk in that courtroom, there shouldn't be an ounce of prejudice or bias at all. That's where the phrase all men are equal should stand as a foundation. Otherwise, the courtroom and its proceedings are flawed. And so at that point, Atticus drops his voice and he says, in the name of God, believe him. And then we have Cal walk up the aisle, and in chapter 21, she has that note she hands to Atticus, and basically she can't find the kids. So remember, Mr. Underwood had already seen them, so he busts them out, and they have they go up and see Atticus, and Atticus tells him to go home and eat dinner and stay home. But at this point, Jim's like, we want to come back. We want to hear what's going to happen. And they've already heard everything. So Atticus relents. So on their way home, Calpurnia's letting Jim have an earful. And of course, Scout is like loving every ounce of it. Because remember, Jim's been acting like he's so much better than everybody. And he gets in so much trouble. And Scout loves it. So they go home and they're eating. And Aunt Alexandra doesn't, it says she hardly says anything, and that she almost looks hurt and sad. But they eat and they get back to court, and Jim this entire time is like, we've got this. There's no way we can't win. And just like we would all be like, there's no way that the evils can win. I mean, no way. And Reverend Sykes tells him, now don't be so confident, Mr. Jim. And I ain't ever seen a jury decide in favor of a colored man over a white man. But for Jim, he's like, there's no way. And remember, he's learning a lot about the world as well. Okay. So as they're talking, the jury's been out a really, really long time. Okay. So long that it says Dill falls asleep, Scout falls asleep, and it's almost like it's a dream. But eventually Mr. Tate and them get the jury back into order, and it says if the jury convicts a man as guilty, they never look at him. And it says when that jury walks in, it never looks at Tom Robinson. They don't. And that they decide he's guilty. And it says Jim is just like has his hands on the rail, and he's just clenching it because he's so upset. And then Atticus leaves, and it's of course Reverend Sykes at that moment wakes her up and says, you need to stand up, your father's walking out. And it says the entire balcony stands in kind of respect, or for respect for Atticus and what he's done. So chapter 22, it literally starts off with the little sentence that says it was Jim's turn to cry. He can't understand it. He's like, it's not right, it's not right. And of course it isn't. And Atticus agrees with him. And the big thing for Jim is he had this idea that all these people in Macomb County, all the people around him were good people. And in this moment, that belief of his is totally shaken. And so everything he's believed about the people around him in the town he's lived in for him is wrong, or it doesn't seem like it's right. He always thought these people were the greatest people. And he doesn't understand how they could say that Tom Robinson was guilty because it was obvious that he wasn't. Okay. Um, so in this little section, remember this is still after the trial. So Atticus is totally worn out. He goes to sleep. The kids go to sleep. And the next morning you have breakfast, and Atticus is like, where did all this stuff come from? And Cal shows the kitchen with it's tons of food from the African American community, basically thanking him for what he did for Tom. And it was just for Tom, but it also helps every African American that goes to court. And it shows them that there are people willing to stand up for them so that they're treated correctly or that their story is told. And of course, Atticus' eyes fills with tears, and he's like, times are too hard for them to be giving me all this food. And he tells Cal to tell him thank you. And so Dill comes over and he eats, and the kids are talking, and they go outside. And of course, you have a group out there with Miss Maudie. Uh, you have Mr. Avery out there, Stephanie Crawford, and Stephanie Crawford wants to ask everything and talk about everyone and everything. And so they're talking about the trial because when the kids come out, all they do is stare at them. So the kids know they're being talked about. So Miss Maudie leaves the group and goes and sees the kids, and she's baked them some cakes. And remember, the kids like to talk to her because they know that she'll tell them the truth. So Miss Maudie um, basically says, Jim, don't worry. Things aren't as bad as you think they are. And he says, there are some men that are born in this world that were born to do the unpleasant jobs for us, like this Tom Robinson case. And she says that your dad is one of them. Okay. And for Jim, he's kind of cynical. He's so angry and he can't understand why the people of Macomb County would do this. And he says that we're the safest, or this is Maudie, we're the safest folks in the world. We're so rarely called on to be Christians, but when we are, we've got men like Atticus to go for us. And Jim says he wishes the rest of the county thought like that and thought like Atticus. And Miss Maudie's like, there are a lot of people that do. And Jim's like, who? Who stood up for Tom Robinson? And think about, she's like trying to point out that there are people that feel like this, but they don't always step up like Atticus did. And she talks about Heck Tate. She talks about Judge Taylor giving um, this trial to Atticus. Like, he chose him because he knew Atticus would present it fairly. Link Dees and all of these individuals. And for Jim, he's like, it didn't take him any time to do this. And Miss Maudie brings out none of it was an accident. She said she sat on her porch and waited and waited and waited for them to come home. And she said the longer that the jury stayed out, she said the more and more that because she literally said to herself, Atticus can't win. There's no way he can win. But he says he's the only one who can make a jury stay out that long on a case like this in the South. And she said, we're making a step. It's a baby step. We're making a step in the right direction. And for Jim, he's like, I don't care. As soon as I get grown, I'm going to do something about this. And, good. That's what Atticus wants his kids to feel, is see the injustices and try to make them right, because that's what Atticus does. And then you have Dill and them talk about he wants to be a clown, but a clown that laughs at others. Basically, this whole thing has him upset and depressed about the people around him and what's going on in the world. Kind of breaks their hearts. And then you have, you have at the end of this, it says Miss Stephanie and Miss Rachel are just waving wildly at the kids after they leave Miss Maudie. And you find out that in the middle of town, in front of the post office, Bobby Ewell spit in Atticus's face and said that he'd get him or get back at him if it took him the rest of his life. So for Atticus, he doesn't really care. All he says about it is, "I wish he wouldn't chew tobacco when he spits." He's not worried about it at all. But you find out the kids are really afraid. So Atticus talks to them about it, and he says, "Don't worry about it. He was just mad. He took it out on me, but he's not gonna do anything else." And for him, he says, "If I can save Mayella a beating at home, then it was worth it." And that makes Jim and Scout feel a little bit better, but Aunt Alexander's like, "Don't you dare think it's over because a man that's like him, he's gonna do something back. I don't know what it'll be," but she uses the term something furtive, something sneaky and low down. So after their little conversation, the kids feel better, and it talks about they talk a little bit about law in here with Atticus and Jim especially, and they talk about Tom, that he's in a prison that's 70 miles away, and that for Atticus, he feels like once they get their appeal, that's not in Macomb, he feels like they'll have a really good chance to get Tom off because there's not enough evidence to support anything. In fact, it's contrary. But he says if he loses his appeal, he'll go to the electric chair. So for Jim, he just doesn't understand why even if he's guilty, why he has to go to the chair. And they talk about what should be a capital offense and what shouldn't be. And Atticus brings up the fact he has no problem with rape being a capital offense, but what he does have problem with is the fact that juries are saying people are guilty without evidence, without pure evidence, without somebody saying, "I was there, I saw it," etc. He said that's the problem that he has with this jury. There was no evidence. And for him, that's the biggest problem that he has. Um, and of course, Jim says, if he was on the jury, of course, he would have been able to see it through it. And Atticus agrees. Like he's like, if I had a bunch of you, Tom would be free right now. But that's not what we have. And he says those individuals that were on the jury, those 12 men, are perfectly, he says, reasonable men in life, but they have these bits and pieces in their lives that are flawed where they have prejudices. And he says, when it's a white man's word against a black man's, the white man always wins. They're ugly, but those are the facts of life. And for Jim, he's like, that's not right. That's not right. And Atticus is like, of course it's not right. Okay. And he says, Atticus says, as you grow older, you'll see white men cheat black men every day of their lives, of your life. But let me tell you something, and don't you forget it. Whenever a white man does that to a black man, no matter who he is, how rich he is, or how fine a family he comes from, that man is trash. And it says that the kids are just like they can feel Atticus's rage, and they know that this bit that like Atticus doesn't speak like this very often, so they know that this is extremely important for them to learn. And Jim talks about like juries next. Okay, so Atticus, why don't people like us and Miss Maudie sit on juries? I don't understand. How come we have these 12 men? And so you find out women are allowed to sit on juries. Okay, and they kind of tease and make jokes about how the trials will never end because women always talk and ask a lot of questions. And then Atticus also brings up like, what about Link D's and people like that are supporting Tom? And he says, in this small town, a lot of people are afraid. And they're afraid of making enemies in the town and losing business and things like that. And it reiterates the fact that a lot of people feel like Atticus and Jim, but they're afraid to put their own lives and everything like that at risk. And they just trust that Atticus or people like Atticus will do that for them. Okay. So at the after they talk about the jury, Atticus brings up somebody that was on the jury, and that was for Atticus and for Tom. And you find out that it was one of the individuals, one of the Cunninghams, that was outside the jail that night that tried to get to Tom. And so they, he says he learned one thing about the Cunninghams is that once you earn their respect, they were for you tooth and nail. And he said if he would have had a couple of Cunninghams on that jury, it would have been a hung jury and Tom would have been freed and there'd be a mistrial. So, of course, at that point, they're so excited, and Scout was like, "Oh, I want to invite Walter over." And then you haven't had Anne Alexander's been in there the whole time, but she hasn't said much. Okay, um, and so when Atticus leaves a room, she wants to invite Walter over, and Anne Alexander says, "No, you're not having that boy over here." And for Scout, she doesn't get it, and you have them going back and forth, and then Anne Alexander says, "You're not inviting Walter Cunningham to this house, okay?" And he says, "And I'm going to tell you why. Because he is trash. That's why you can't play with him." It says, "It doesn't matter if you clean him up and shine him as good as a brand new penny. He's never going to be like you are. He doesn't, he's basically saying his family is trash and he's not on the same level as the Finches are." And of course, Scout's extremely mad about that. And Atticus kind of sticks his head in there, and Jim pulls Scout to the side to try to base pulls him pulls her out of the room to kind of take the situation down a notch so they don't get a huge fight or a huge argument. So they go in there, and Jim gives Scout a Tootsie Roll to eat and to take his mind or take her mind off of what just happened with Anne Alexandra. He shows her his chest hair because he now has it and he's a growing man. Okay. And they talk about what Auntie said. He said, "Scout, don't let Auntie aggravate you." And she says, "I'm not upset that she thinks I bother Atticus. That's not what it is." But she said, calling Walter Cunningham trash, she's like, "It bothered me. It's not true. He's not trash. He's not like the Evils. How can she say he's trash?" And so at the end of this chapter, you have the kids talk about kinds of folks. It's the last page and a half. Sorry, I'm adjusting my computer here. And for Jim, he's kind of analyzing the whole situation. He says, "I think there's four kinds of folks in Macomb County." And he goes through, he says, "There's kinds like us, ordinary people like us, and the neighbors. There's the Cunninghams out in the woods, the kind like the Evils down at the dump, and the Negroes. Those are the four that he thinks Macomb County has." And for him, as he's talking about it, the only thing he thinks that separates them is education, and which makes some sense and what he's thinking, okay? But for Scout, she says that's not. I don't agree with that. And for Jim, with his argument, it makes sense. Most of the African American community can't read and write. The Evils can't. The Cunninghams can a little bit, but because they're working so much, they don't go to school all the time. And then the Finches, of course, read really well. And for Scout, she's like, "No, I don't think that's right," because she says everybody no. She said everybody's got to learn. Nobody's born knowing how to read, write, and things like that. And she says, "Walter's as smart as he can be. He just gets held back sometimes because he has to stay out and help his dad. Nothing's wrong with him. No, Jim, I think there's just one kind of folks, and that's folks." And she kind of hits on something pretty well there because Jim, like, he can see that, but what he doesn't understand, and he puts this, he's like, "That's what I thought too, but when I was your age," of course, because he's so old and grown. He says, "But if there's just one kind of folks, why can't we all get along?" Which is a huge, just little nugget of information that these kids, in their innocence, although the innocence and naivete that they had at the beginning is kind of slowly going away. And they're kind of, because of what they've experienced with Tom Robinson's case, they're kind of addressing issues that are deep seated in all communities. now and it doesn't matter when. There are always groups of folks. I mean, look at the world today that don't get along. And for Jim, he just tries to put a reason to it. It's got to be the education. But for Scout, she's like, no. I mean, Walter's just as smart as anybody. He hasn't had the time to be taught everything. And so for Jim, he's like, well, why can't we all get along? And then, and that's what he longs for. And at the end, he goes, I think I'm starting to understand why Boo Radley stayed inside the house all the time, because he wants to stay in there. And then chapter 24 is when we have a missionary tea over at the Finch house. Atticus isn't there. It says he always leaves. And there's a huge group of ladies there. You have Scout helping. She's wearing a dress. Miss Maudie's there. And Scout helps Calpurnia. And they're all sitting there talking. And they kind of pick at Scout at first, talking about where are your breeches. And she has them on under her dress, which um, it says they kind of laugh at, but she wasn't trying to be funny. She's just being truthful. And Miss Maudie doesn't laugh. Miss Maudie's there the whole time with her. And they kind of joke and poke fun of her and like, don't you want to be a lawyer? Why aren't you down at the courtroom? And Miss Maudie kind of holds her hand and defends her because it, in reality, in that moment, Scout doesn't really know how to. And she doesn't understand everything the ladies are talking about. So Miss Maudie kind of stands up for her. So in the next section, they talk about the Munras, okay? And so basically what this next section of the chapter is showing is how hypocritical these ladies are, okay? So they talk about J. Grimes Everett, and he's a missionary that goes into Africa, and he brings the gospel to the Munras, which is a great thing, okay? Um, but after they talk about him going in there and what a great thing that is, because remember, it's a missionary tea. They talk about the African American people that they know and that they have in their house as maids and things like that, and saying that they're acting all high and mighty and that they're actually equal with or should be equal with us. And that's not how it goes, and that's not going to happen. Um, and if they don't get their attitude right, they're going to fire them and things like that. So J. Grimes Everett going in and presenting the gospel and in all of that and presenting that information to a group of Africans is okay, but treating the African Americans that are there in their own home as Christians and as equals is not okay. So it shows them as hypocritical, and Miss Maudie the entire time is just biting her tongue, and then she throws in there some icy bits that puts them at some of the ladies in their place, and they kind of quit talking about it. So in this moment, um, you have Atticus come in there, and it says his face is white, and before that, I forgot this part. Um, it talks to you about how when Tom Robinson went to jail, it's like he gave up all hope, like he can't get out. And of course, Atticus knows the whole appeal process and all of that. Like, there's a really great chance he's going to get out. But it says for Tom, when he gets into prison, he's done. Like he sees no hope at all. And so after it talks about that, that's when you have him come in the doorway. And it says he never comes back when there's these missionary teas, so they know it's odd that he's there. So it says his face is white, and he pulls Cal and Aunt Alexander and Scal into the other room, and you find out that Tom's dead and that they shot him as he was trying to escape the prison. And Aunt Alexandra is completely shaken by this. It's not what you anticipate. And she says, didn't they try to just stop him? Like, did they give him a warning for her? She's like, why couldn't they grab him? And she's like, well, I don't understand. And Atticus says, yes, they yelled at him to stop. They fired warning shots in the air, and then they shot him 17 times. And he said if he would have, had his good arm, he would have, he was so fast, he would have made it out. And Aunt Alexander's completely just overwhelmed and angry at this point. She said, this is the last straw, Atticus. And for her, she just can't let this go. And for Atticus, he's like, depends on how you look at it. Like for them, it's like, what's one more? He says, what's one more Negro more or less among 200 of them? He wasn't Tom to them. He was an escaping prisoner. So what we learn here is that as they've been going through this trial, and Alexander's learned a little bit about Tom as well. And that's why she says, can't believe this would happen. Why is this happening? And so he gets Cal to take with him to tell Helen Robinson the news. And it says Aunt Alexander just sits down and buries her hands in her face. And um, she, when she puts her face up, she says, "I don't approve of everything he does." And but for her, she sees it tearing her brother apart. And she says it's tearing him to pieces. He doesn't show it much, but it is. I've seen him when, and she says, "What else do they want from him, Maudie? What else?" And Miss Maudie says, what what does who want, Alexander?" She says, "This town. What else are they going to ask of him?" And it kind of reiterates what Maudie said. They have people like Atticus to step up and do the hard things when the town themselves are afraid to do it. And he says they're perfectly willing to let him wreck his health doing what they're afraid to do. And Miss Maudie says, "Shh, they're going to hear you in there." And he says, "Have you ever thought of it this way, Alexander? Whether Maycomb knows it or not, we're paying the highest tribute we can pay to a man. We trust him to do right, and it's that simple." And she's trying to tell him that for the town, they trust Atticus. And for Atticus, he's willing to take that on. For Aunt Alexandra, she just sees what it does to him emotionally, and she's upset by that fact. But she has to realize that Atticus knows what the town wants of him, and he's willing to do that no matter the cost. So, um, yeah, through the through that last little section when she says, we trust him to do what's right. It's that simple. And Alexander questions asks the question who, and it's just like Jim. Who trusts him? Who thinks right? Who's really on his side? And and Maudie responds just like she did to Jim. The handful of people in this town who say that fair play is not marked white only. A handful of people who say a fair trial is for everybody, not just us. The handful of people with enough humility to think when they look at a Negro, theirs but for the Lord's kindness am I. A handful of people in this town with a background, that's who they are. The people that look at all of us as God's creation. That's what she's saying. And she's trying to let Aunt Alexander know there are more people out there than you think, and that she's also kind of teaching Aunt Alexandra in a way what Atticus has been teaching his children growing up, that they're all the same in God's eyes, and that they're all God's creation, and nobody should be looked down upon, no matter where they come from, what their last name is, or what color they are. So in that moment, Aunt Alexandra kind of puts herself together, and they go back in there and they continue with the tea like nothing happened. And it says, at the very last paragraph, it says, Aunt Alexandra looked across the room at me and smiled. She looked at a tray of cookies and she let Scout take them around. And at the end of it, she said, with my very best company manners, I asked her if she would have some. It says, after all, if Auntie could be a lady at this time, at a time like this, so could I. So it's this first moment where Aunt Alexander and Scout start to really kind of understand one another. She starts to, and it starts with Aunt Alexander starting to understand her brother. And then you see them kind of meet halfway. Aunt Alexandra understands Scout a little bit more, and then Scout kind of understands a little bit of what being a lady is, and they're starting to realize that they can mold the two of them together and be free to as far as who they want to be, and be pretty fantastic people with a combination of the two. And those are your 4 chapters plus 20, since I forgot that one.